All right, so as we continue our discussion into postmodernism, and I kind of showed you some of the themes. Once again, it's virtually impossible to define because it can mean so many things, but it does have themes. And we mentioned some of those themes are tolerance, multiculturalism, and diversity. And I would also throw in like inclusion into that. It's this idea of bringing in other voices, other perspectives. Now, not everyone, of course, is happy about those virtues or values of postmodernism, and they actually see them as very negative, if not dangerous things. And so I want to show you a video from what I would consider a kind of typical evangelical church and their response to postmodernism. So we may not watch this whole thing. We'll see how much we can take. All right, can you guys see my shared video?
Yep.
I'll read this allegory I got several years ago. Brother Jesse Morrell wrote the first part of this. But we looked around at the condition of the church in our own local areas and places we visited and been, and saw some things that we wanted to add to it. So I'm not taking away what Brother Jesse had wrote. Brother Jesse got some good stuff here, but I want to add to it and show us the condition of the church is today. The title of this allegory, we've already heard, it's called "The Church is Comfortable and Tolerant." So once upon a time in the land called Fieldgood, there was a church. This new church was called the Church of the Comfortable and Tolerant. Very recently, this church hired a new pastor, Pastor Peacekeeper, who just graduated from the seminary, smooth talking. The elder pastor had become blind and deaf and had led several of the congregation off recently into a ditch. What he didn't realize was that the congregation had formed a committee to remove him when he refused to sell hot dogs from the church building to raise funds for the local church vacation bus. Pastor Peacekeeper once made a terrible mistake. He wrongfully allowed Mr. Conscience into the pulpit. Mr. Conscience did nothing but call human mistakes sin and called the good folks of the congregation to repent. Because Mr. Conscience had never been properly trained and instructed in the seminary smooth talking, he did not know that he wasn't supposed to talk about those things. The congregation of the Comfortable and Tolerant were shocked at Mr. Conscience's audacity and arrogance. They said things among themselves like, "Who does this self-righteous legalist think he is? Coming and talking to us like that. Why should we allow this false preacher among us any longer? They continue to persecute us." Pastor Peacekeeper terribly regretted to let Mr. Conscience into the pulpit. Mr. Conscience had betrayed the trust he had with the pastor. So Pastor Peacekeeper asked Mr. Conscience to please leave the church. He was not welcome there any longer. Everyone was happy that Mr. Conscience was asked to leave, except one special guest called the Holy Ghost. So the Holy Ghost and Mr. Conscience left together. And after a while, nobody noticed that they were even gone. Wow. Once things went back to normal the way they always had been, everyone was happy once again in the land called Fieldgood. What sounds like a no. Pastor Peacekeeper kept continuing to sugarcoat sweet and wonderful lies and that made everyone comfortable in their sins and heavily guarded his pulpit from the brazen truths. Yeah. Who could blame him, you see? The pastor loved his new house, his new church, building someone else's labor to build and pay for. Yeah. And of course, he loved his new income. He wouldn't be happy, or he couldn't lay such precious things on the line. Especially since his lovely wife, Jezebel Keeper, would never be happy ever being just another saint on the pew, but desire the places of honor and glory. Where else would they allow her to come to church dressed like a harlot and singing and dancing seductively in front of the congregation? Yeah. Yeah. She really made a pleasant income also selling Mary Kay and Avon to the women of the church also. The congregation of the Comfortable Tolerant loved you pastor's sermons. Some of their favorites were "God is happy with everyone." Here's some of Joel Osteen mess. Yeah. Everything is fine and dandy, and there is nothing but good times ahead. Yeah. They frequently raise funds to support their many specialized programs to be part of the worldly fashion. Aware church. There were Tai Chi classes, yoga, aerobics held in the new gym fellowship hall, daycare expenses, week-long trips to the beach and mountains, where they could get in touch with their inner force or run around half naked together. Yeah. This all this allowed them to become more family-like and less intimidating to the newcomers of the church. They really didn't like the modest dress code and the restrictions the former pastor placed on them either. How could someone use the scriptures to tell us what to do and what to look like anyways, commented elder board member. That is just old-fashioned and stuffy. We are hip. We love, love, love everybody, no matter what they do. Hate the sin, not the sinner. The congregation of the comfortable tolerant loud and loudly and voted 200 to 49 to allow queers to minister behind the pulpit of the church. Oh. After all, they had come to a new awareness recently that being a homo was not against God. And not only was it those who practiced sodomy could receive communion, but serve it to the people and preach also. My. And last, the ladies' retreat and dying the spa and hair salon. All the women were refreshed after getting their full body massages, a full makeover, spending quality time in the swimming pool in their new bikinis. They spent their time brainstorming during retreat and added a ladies' drumming circle and dream interpretation meeting to the already packed schedule of the church bulletin. Once a week, they met with other churches for a healing and deliverance session and invited the latest prophetesses and prophets to tell the fortunes of the interested church members. Yeah. Their hot dog sales and Sunday dinners were so profitable that they were able to buy a tour bus and a trailer for the house band. Since the youth rock concerts were so popular, they started holding them at schools, purchased TV commercials and cable TV, and pastor peacekeepers still good sermons and rock concerts on local billboards, and designed a new logo that looked like major TV broadcasting companies to pay for these outrageous debts. The church started selling angel food to the community. So instead of feeding the homeless and the poor, they were now making a profit on the non-cooking families of the town. Yeah. Eventually, the task of being a spiritual leader of the church became so burdensome that Pastor Peacekeeper had to purchase the most up-to-date media equipment and hire somebody to run it. On Wednesday night, to give himself a break, each week, they showed movies of other TV preachers and TV sermons of the latest DVDs of the phenomenal speaker, Reverend Engineers. Yes, sir. He had never heaped himself such a teacher in his career as a pastor. Reverend Engineers could be seen in the local congregation every week, bringing his new relevant subjects out of the NIV version of the Bible. He was teaching others that easy believism was the newest Christian fad, along with rock concerts and videos. After all, the words were about Jesus. Even the people singing and playing the instruments don't look or live like true Christians ought to. That shouldn't matter. God loves everyone, right? After all, how else are we going to reach this generation? The congregation was so well entertained and proud of the new media system, they decided to get more of the community involved by having coffee houses, Super Bowl parties, in the sanctuary. Yeah. And even Pizza Huts. In the summer, having more movies, or summer having movie night on the Friday night long, so the families could watch their favorite movie shows right at the church instead of going to the theater. They had a drama team, charismatic praise team, and a house band. They purchased all the equipment needed to add theatrics to their shows, like theater lighting, smoke machines, and a new stage. They put on many plays and performances, especially on Easter, trunk-or-treat parties and judgment houses on Halloween, and Christmas production that involved intricate scripts and costumes that they purchased also. This way, Pastor Peacekeeper was absolutely guaranteed that the church of the comfortable tower was so busy and so satisfied and happy as they sat in their own sin and spiritual complacency. In fact, the world couldn't tell them apart. They all lived happily ever after. That is, until they were cast into hell together for eternity. Amen. The point is, rather than preparing the way of the Lord and making it straight, these preachers are so-called hirelings are removing all the bumps out of the road to hell to make it as comfortable as possible for those who travel on them. The backslid church utterly refuses to remove the log out of their own eyes, and therefore utterly refuses to remove anything out of anyone else's eyes also. There you go. The church vehemently opposes those who try to do so also. God help those who try to clean up the church and the world. Joseph Park said it best. The man whose little sermon is repent sets himself against his age and would be battered mercilessly by the age whose moral tone he challenges. There's but one end for that man. That's all of his head. You better not try to preach repentance until you've blessed your head to heaven for the gospel. Amen.
All righty. Talk to me. I wish we could have got a pan of the camera at the congregation, because it sounded like there may be like 2 people there. And I can pretty much guarantee you there's no one in their late teens, early 20s sitting in that church.
Was that like a made-up story or like?
Yes. It was called The Allegory of the Postmodern Church.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And he didn't write that, he found that somewhere, but it really resonated with him and apparently whoever was in his congregation.
Yeah.
All right, so what I'm inquiring is, he's obviously preaching to the choir, okay, his group and the way he sees church and what it's about. But then he's just going on this tirade about all these different methods and techniques and even intentions of these other churches, right? And so I want to know, basically I want an evaluation of his little allegory of the postmodern church. There was truth in there.
Yeah.
In fact, there was quite a bit of truth in there. But the tone, you know, it's not just the truth you're presenting, but I would say also how you present it. And I was having a real hard time with the mocking tone,
Yeah.
personally.
It was kind of like merciless. You know, it was just like straight up just condemnation, and even like things that in and of themselves aren't necessarily like negative or positive. He was even condemning those aspects of it as well. It seemed like.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. And some of the things that he was saying, I didn't really understand like why he was pushed over the edge about it as such a negative thing. But maybe that is because
Do you have examples?
I am, well, whenever he was like talking about like having movie nights at the church and like everyone hanging out, maybe getting Pizza Hut, I was like, well, what? You don't necessarily understand what the harm is and things like that.
Do any of you know what the harm might be? Or at least from his perspective?
I didn't even really hear very well of what he was saying.
Okay.
It was just the quality of it I didn't really understand.
Yeah, his accent's a little hard to understand. Yeah, my internet cut out for a little bit of it. But I don't know, I agree with what you said. I think there was some truth to what he was saying, but definitely he had like a very condemning, judgmental tone. And I think like calling homosexual people homos and queers is pretty offensive.
That's when you pop back. That was good timing. Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to a church having standards or teaching what they believe is biblical truth. But if we're not doing that in love, if it's the spirit of condemnation and legalism and judgmentalism, I think we've got a really big problem. And that was just oozing all of those things. And I would have been so uncomfortable, I wouldn't have been able to sit in my seat. I would have been up out of my seat and out of that church so quick it would have made their head spin. I understand this desire to cling to what you believe is the truth, but he was put out even by different evangelistic techniques, like having a worship band or doing a passion play or having dramas. I mean, that was like the Middle Ages. That's how the illiterate society was told the gospel message. They couldn't read and write it, so they had to get it through passion plays, through the music, through the stained glass windows, through the homilies of the priest. And I think with different times and different technologies, I mean, I'm shocked that they had a YouTube video, quite frankly. I mean, that's really progressive. But.
And I think like, especially with the history of that kind of evangelism, I guess if that's the right word, like, I think we as a humanity tend to jump from one extreme to another. So it kind of makes sense why we would jump like so heavily to the opposite side of that spectrum if like what people have been like shown is that condemnation and that judgment, because now it's like the complete opposite, like we're accepting everybody no matter what. So I think that's just like another, just like, I don't know, just expression of what happened. Bless you.
Kind of like that pendulum swing
Yeah.
of we go way over here and then people react and want to come
Yeah.
away. Yeah, kind of. And I get it. It could be really scary if you're a very conservative traditional church and you see all the churches around you, or at least the ones on television and these mega preachers. It's just like a show, right? It's just like a big production with professional musicians, professional speakers, everyone's dressed to the nines. It's running like clockwork. And yeah, I understand the desire, hey, we're worshiping God. We want to be professional. We want to be, do our best. We want to honor God with our performance. I understand those arguments, but the heart, right? The intentionality. Why are you singing? Why are you preaching? Why are you doing these things? And I don't want to speak for God, but I think the scriptures are pretty clear. God's so interested in the intention of the heart over our excellence of speech or the amount of money we can give or the other talents we may share, and having that willing heart. But yeah, I'm not opposed to professionalism or practice, or everything doesn't just have to be spontaneous as the Spirit leads us. There is a time and place for practice, for performance. But that's where I think we need to be gracious to one another and not be judging other churches, especially on form. I would be much more concerned about intention. I mean, if you're doing it just to have cushier pews and a bigger social media presence and bringing more money in, well, obviously, those are not desirable things. But if you're using the technology or the culture of the day to spread the message of Jesus, I would have a really hard time arguing with that. And this isn't the first time people have done that. This happened in the 60s, like the Billy Graham Crusades. They would have like these big like Christian rock concerts, like the Jesus music, the Jesus people. They would have dancers. It was like a festival. And yet thousands of people, when they heard the message of the gospel and God's love for us, were drawn and came forward. And I don't know if you ever heard Billy Graham speak, but he's not all emotional and charismatic. I mean, he's pretty even-toned, and he is just very matter-of-factly going through the problem of our relationship with God, God's solution to that broken relationship through Jesus, and that Jesus wants a relationship with all of us. And I just think it's so powerful. But when I was a kid, I grew up in churches like that one we just saw, and we couldn't even watch the Billy Graham Crusades because he was not one of us. He was a compromiser. He's using the ways of the world to try to spread the message of the kingdom. And he associates with people that don't share our doctrinal values because he was very ecumenical. If he could get Roman Catholics to come out, charismatics, Pentecostals, Eastern Orthodox, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Baptists, he just wanted everyone to come together with the intention of sharing the gospel. That was his main focus. And the more conservative churches kind of blacklisted him or eschewed him. But you could see the impact he had on American culture at large. Okay, any more talk about that?
Well, I guess kind of going off of that a little bit, I was reading in John 17 the other day.
Ooh.
When Jesus was praying for the future believers, and he's talking about how one of his greatest desires is that we would come together in complete unity with one another. And it just makes me wonder, are a lot of people missing that aspect? are we so busy like grappling over our little theological differences that we forget about the fact that we're supposed to be united, you know? And it says like through unity, like that's how people will know that Jesus is Lord, and like that's how like people will
By
know.
our love,
Yeah.
how we love one another. That should be the clarion call.
Yeah.
And I just want to show you where I kind of want to go. I'm not going to go there today, but I want to make you aware of this. And I think the guy's name is John Stott, or Stott, S-T-O-T-T, I believe. Or am I? Will you kind of adjust that? So I noticed in some of my other videos, I was out of the screen. But he wrote a book, and I'm pretty sure he wrote this in the 60s, and it was called Christian Counterculture. And the timing was perfect, because in the 60s, when you think of counterculture, you were thinking of the hippies for the most part. People who had rejected the traditional values, and they were into like sex, drugs, rock and roll, peace and freedom, make love, not war, that whole kind of mentality. Kind of like, let's get back to the earth, let's get away from industrialized society. Let's have more of a communal existence than like a hierarchical capitalistic system. So really radical, challenging ideas to the American paradigm. And what John Stott was saying is Christians should be the most radical of all the countercultures. People should look at us and our lifestyle and how we treat each other and say, wow, those people are so different. And it's not being different just to be different. He's saying if we actually applied the gospel to our lives and things like the Sermon on the Mount, if we really lived out those teachings of Jesus, we would be so radically different from the culture in which we live that we would be like a light on a hill. And if those characteristic traits are rooted in love of God and then love of each other, that is what's going to draw people. Not because we have a better apologetic, we have better evidence, we have more money, we have more success. No, it's showing that love and compassion, the fruit of the Spirit, is radical in our culture and in our world. And when you think of like the postmodern virtues that we talked about, of like toleration, multiculturalism, diversity. Like I mentioned last class, the Christian virtues are so much higher than these. Instead of toleration, we're called to love. Multiculturalism, there is no Jew or Greek, bond or free, but we are all one in Christ Jesus. Christianity should be the most inclusive religion in the world because it's not based on your genetics or your background or your country of origin. Abraham is called the father of many nations, right? But it's not genetically. When we talk about Abraham being the father of faith, it's like this spiritual lineage we have of him. And that is where we find our unity, not in pedigree, not in genetics, but in Christ. And there, the diversity, it's not that we all want to be the same, but we're actually looking for unity in diversity. So I would say Christian virtues not only mirror a lot of the postmodern virtues, but they're even stronger or more demanding than what the postmoderns are asking of us. The solutions, of course, are going to be very different for a Christian than, say, a critical theorist or other different types of postmodern ways of thought. because all of these values are only accomplished in the person and work of Christ. And as we have his Spirit within us, that is how we're able to love. We can be tolerant in the flesh. I really believe this kind of love requires the Spirit. The same, we can have multiculturalism through just thinking, you know, it is a good idea to be inclusive, but outside of the Spirit, I don't really know how you can accomplish that. And the same with diversity. Diversity is a fantastic thing, and with it comes great benefit, but the difficulty is how do you keep diverse thoughts or people together without tearing yourselves apart, because there's so many different perspectives and points of view. And once again, I would say it's the unity of the Spirit that allows us to have wildly diverse members of the body, and yet we're all still functioning under the headship of Christ. And see, those are things that the postmoderns don't have an answer to how we accomplish these virtues, except maybe through ostracism, boycotting, culture wars, those sorts of techniques you see being used. You could do it through political pressure, but once again, even if you get a majority of people thinking like this and you try to impose it on people that are not buying into it, it's just going to create tension. And that's where our country is right now. We are so split. I mean, we had a record number of people voting in the last election, and the difference was only like 7 million votes. It's amazing. I think about 150 million votes, more or less, were cast, and the difference was like within 7 million votes. And so we have a very polarized country, and maybe our conversation will lead into this, but at the moment, evangelical fundamentalism has sided with right-wing conservative politics and agenda items. And we find many of the people who identify as postmoderns or critical race theorists aligning themselves with the left or with the Democratic Party. And so you get these really interesting tensions, right? I mean, I'm surprised they haven't brought up critical race theory or critical theory at the school yet, because a lot of schools are having to deal with that, whether or not that's going to be taught.
I just feel like Christians as a whole, it seems like there's like a general fear about addressing like controversial topics in the world. It's like we just have a tendency to avoid conversations like that in the church. At least that's what I've noticed.
Or they just don't like the controversy.
I don't know. Like, I don't know. It just.
At my church, I think that people just honestly believe that everyone thinks like them. And that's very hard on me, because I'll be sitting there with people that I love and care about, and they'll just be saying incredibly offensive things, just matter-of-factly. And I don't want to start anything necessarily, but I just want to say, you realize not everyone holds that point of view. And that's not necessarily a biblical point of view, if you want to go down that path next.
Yeah.
And it makes it really difficult.
Yeah. I think also like we have a tendency to like concrete or like set our opinions as fact without actually like, because there's a lot of gray area in the Bible, there's a lot of things that aren't addressed. I think personally, we have a tendency to just make our opinions fact, and everyone else who has a different opinion is just automatically wrong.
So is Christian counterculture, is that something you guys would care to explore? I'm not going to do it today, but I'd like to prep a little for it because I haven't taught on that in a while.
Yeah.
But that book helped me so much as a young Christian as I was becoming disillusioned with my traditional conservative upbringing, and to realize there were other ways to walk with Jesus that wasn't just following these traditional models we had laid out in front of us. And that was part of my own making my faith my own and not my parents'. It was like they taught me all this great stuff, but I had to come to a place where it had to be mine. We can't live off inherited faith. And what I realized was, even though we love the same Jesus, there were a lot of ways that they were living out their faith that I didn't think were very helpful or necessarily even biblical. And all right, well, I guess I won't beat that to death.
That's what scares, I mean, that's what scared me, because there was a faith that was like, I wasn't following my own, it was based on someone else's, the environment I grew up in. And so when push came to shove, I was like, whoa, what do I really believe in?
Mhm. Okay. This, I'm not going to make you watch a 2.5-hour video with me, but I would highly recommend this Stephen Hicks guy. I showed you some of his, and this is in my apologetics playlist on Darkwater Hermit. So if you want to find it, it's going to scroll down to the bottom because I just added these. But I like him because he's more of an academic, and he's kind of tracing but more detailed, like I did for you, like the history of postmodernism. And he's not going back to the ancient Greeks, but he's showing like the promises of the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason and what they hoped to achieve. And they did achieve much of it, but it was kind of like a Pandora's box. There was also pain and suffering that came with the new innovations and the new understanding. For example, medicine. That was one of the promises of the Enlightenment, that we can use reason and science to cure all the diseases, the things that afflict human beings. And they did wonders, the polio vaccines, and tuberculosis, and all these things that killed millions, they were able, or damaged millions, they were able to find, if not cures for, at least vaccines for. But that same science was used to develop weapons of mass destruction, thermonuclear warheads that could also kill millions. And so it's like giving with one hand and taking with the other. And you could say the same about capitalism. Yes, it raised many boats, right? And many people did better. In fact, it did so well, it kind of took the fangs out of Marxism, because Marxism was all about class struggle. But if all of a sudden now the middle and even the lower classes are living these comfortable lives, it's hard to get people with big screen TVs and full bellies out marching in the streets, right? Even if their percentage of the wealth is minuscule to the 1%ers, it's still so much better than how it might have been without that system that they're a part of. And so that's part of where critical theory shifted, because like I mentioned briefly, it's like Marxism light. And instead of going with class struggle, since now even the lower classes are doing economically well in the West, relatively speaking, and they changed it to other groups like minorities, women, LGBTQ community, other groups that were still suffering under the inequality of the system. Instead of just purely economic class discomfort, now it's focused on other groups. So that becomes a big part of critical race theory, at least. It's not necessarily even about race, but about select groups that are being oppressed and who is doing the oppressing. And so those are the kind of questions it's asking. And I want to show you, this is not a Christian, but so many Christians love this guy, Jordan Peterson. He's a professor, and he really started, I think he first came into fame with he refused to use politically correct pronouns for like transgender students and things like that. And he was really fighting the whole PC talk and saying that that was violating his academic freedom as a professor, which I think is really interesting. And he became kind of a champion of the conservative right, standing up to a lot of these liberal, progressive, postmodern educators. So I want you to hear his take on it, and you'll see why many conservatives, including Christians, resonate with him, even though he's an agnostic. No, he's not a believer.
So I want to recommend a book first to everyone here. It's called Explaining Postmodernism. And it's by a gentleman named Stephen Hicks. And
Can you guys hear that?
you need to understand postmodernism because that's what you're up against. You're up against it far more than you know or think. And it's a much more well-developed and pervasive, pernicious, nihilistic, intellectually attractive
Pernicious.
doctrine than has yet come to public realization. It absolutely dominates the humanities and increasingly the social sciences in the universities. And what's happening, you see, someone once said, unfortunately, I can't remember, it might have been Friedrich Nietzsche, said that everybody is the unconscious exponent of a dead philosopher. And fortunately, the postmodern philosophers, most of them are dead, so that's a good thing. But that doesn't mean that their words aren't continually being spoken by people who are following in their wake, let's say. It's not like any given person is absolutely possessed, say, by the spirit of postmodernism, because often they're not educated enough to know all the details about what it is that has them in their grip. But if you get 20 of them together, and they're all 5% influenced by the postmodernist ethos, you basically have the spirit of the mob that's a mouthpiece for that particular philosophical doctrine. And if you understand the doctrine, then you understand why things are progressing the way that they're progressing. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the doctrine, because it's not optional to understand this. It's absolutely crucial to understand this. You can't underestimate the power of ideas and also the power of words, of course, because ideas are expressed in words. But you see, the postmodernists completely reject the structure of Western civilization. And I mean completely. So I can give you an example in one term. Jacques Derrida, who's head trickster for the postmodernist movement, regarded Western culture, let's call it the patriarchy, as phallogocentric. Okay, so phallo comes from phallus, P-H-A-L-L-O. And so that's the insistence that what you see in Western culture is the consequence of a male-dominated, oppressive, self-serving society. And you might say, well, you know, societies do tend to be self-serving and people in power do tend to act in their best interests, but a tendency is not an absolute, and that's one of the things that needs to be considered continually. There are no shortage of flaws in the manner in which we've structured our society. And compared to any hypothetical utopia, it's an absolutely dismal wreck. But compared to the rest of the world and the plight of other societies throughout the history of mankind, we're doing pretty damn well, and we should be happy to be living in the society that we're living in. So the first thing
If
that you
you're a
might want
white
to know
male.
about postmodernism is that it doesn't have a shred of gratitude. And there's something pathologically wrong with a person who doesn't have any gratitude, especially when they live in what so far is the best of all possible worlds. And so if you're not grateful, you're driven by resentment, and resentment is about the worst emotion that you can possibly experience apart from arrogance. Resentment, arrogance, and deceit. There's an evil triad for you. And if you're bitter about everything that's happening around you, despite the fact that you're bathed in wealth, then there's something absolutely wrong with you. You know, the Black community in the United States is the 18th wealthiest community, 18th wealthiest nation on the planet. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't such a thing as relative poverty, and relative poverty matters. It's an important political economic issue. It's very, very difficult to deal with. But absolute wealth matters too, and Western societies have been absolutely remarkable in their ability to generate and distribute wealth, as you can tell by just looking around and taking a brief bit of consideration for the absolute miracle that even a building like this represents. So you have to educate yourself about postmodernism. Okay, so here's what the postmodernists believe. They don't believe in the individual. That's the logos part. Western culture is phallogocentric. Logo is logos. That's partly the Christian word, but it's also partly the root word of logic. Okay, they don't believe in logic. They believe that logic is part of the process by which the patriarchal institutions of the West continue to dominate and to justify their dominance. They don't believe in dialogue. The root word of dialogue is logos again. They don't believe that people of goodwill can come to consensus through the exchange of ideas. They believe that that notion is part of the philosophical substructure and practices of the dominant culture. So the reason they don't let people who they don't agree with speak on campus is because they don't agree with letting people speak. You see, it's not part of the ethos. Okay, so what else do they believe and not believe? They believe that since you don't have an individual
He's been
identity,
disinvited from many
identity is
campuses.
lost. And that means that you're basically an exemplar of your race, hence white privilege, or you're an exemplar of your gender or your sex or your ethnicity, or you're an exemplar of however you can be classified so that you are placed in the position of victim against the oppressor, because that's the game. And it's a post-Marxist sleight of hand, right? The old Marxist notion was that the world was a battleground between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and that failed to have any philosophical or ethical standing. That argument after the working class actually saw its standard of living massively elevated as a consequence of Western corporate democracy, Western free enterprise democracy. And also as a consequence of the revelations of everything terrible that had happened in every bloody country that ever dared to make equity and the Marxist communist dogma part of their fundamental structure, right? And nothing but murderousness and oppression. And so by the 1970s, it was evident that that game was up. The postmodernist Marxists just basically pulled a sleight of hand and said, okay, if it's not the poor against the rich, it's the oppressed against the oppressor. We'll just redivide the subpopulations in ways that make our bloody philosophy continue in its movement forward, and that's where we're at now. And so for the postmodernists, the world is a Hobbesian battleground of identity groups. They do not communicate with one another because they can't. All there is a struggle for power. And if you're in the predator group, which means you're an oppressor, then you better look out, because you're not exactly welcome, and neither are your ideas. So that's what you're up against. I would say it's time for conservatives to stop apologizing for being conservatives, and you don't apologize to these people. That's a big mistake. Apology, they read apology as an admission of guilt. You don't apologize and you don't back down. You young people that are out there who are university students, you need to take over the student unions. You need to take them back because they're absolute snake pits, and they have been since the 1990s. With regards to the universities, I thought at one point that the best thing to do would be to cut their funding by 25% and let them fight amongst themselves for the remnants, because it would force the universities to decide exactly what's important and what isn't. So I would say the humanities and much of the social sciences has turned into a postmodern neo-Marxist playground for radicals. The scholarship is terrible. 80% of humanities papers aren't cited once.
And that's the kind of point I was trying to make. It's the hard sciences are the ones who are still clinging to that modern narrative. But the humanities went postmodern long, long ago.
Once. And so what that means is that they write papers for each other and they sell them to libraries, and that's how the publishers make their money. No one reads them, but the publishers can print them because the libraries have to buy them, and they're buying them with your tax money. And so all of you who are sitting here are funding a postmodern radical neo-Marxist agenda that has its roots in the university, and your tax money is going towards that. And if you want proof of that, you just go online and look at the websites, especially of disciplines like women's studies, which is pathological right to the core. But it's not just women's studies, it's all the ethnic studies groups. It's anthropology, it's sociology, it's social work, and most of all, it's education. And OISE, for example, in Ontario, is perhaps, apart from the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the most dangerous institution in Canada. It should be defunded. It's as simple as that. They don't do the research they purport to do. They're not interested in at all in education. They're interested in the indoctrination of people as young as they can, as young as they can get their hands on, so to speak. Now, we need to figure out, our society needs to figure out how to stop shunting public tax money to radical left-wing activists. If we were doing that for radical right-wing activists, there would be an absolute storm. But it's happened incrementally since the 1960s, and it needs to stop. So that's partly what the conservatives, not only conservatives, but also liberals, true liberals in the English sense, are up against. I mean, what's happened as a consequence of this postmodern neo-Marxist intellectual invasion is that the center keeps moving. It's moved way to the right now. So if you're a classic liberal, you become a conservative. And so for all of you who are interested in pursuing the conservative agenda, there's a lot of classic liberals that you could be talking to. And then finally, with regards to talking to young people, you finally have something to sell to them. You know, it's not easy to sell conservatism to young people because they want to change things. And that's not what conservatives want to do. They want to maintain things. Well, now you've got something to sell to young people. You can sell them freedom of speech, and you can sell them responsibility. The left is selling them rights. You can sell them responsibility. And I can tell you, because I've received many letters of the sort that Gad was talking about, young people are absolutely starving for someone to provide them with a sense of responsibility and say, look, here's something worth living for, man. You know, you can find meaning in life with freedom, but freedom is a chaotic sort of meaning, right? And freedom isn't the sort of thing that makes people happy. It's the sort of thing that makes people troubled because freedom expands your series of choices, and that makes you nervous and uncertain. So, but responsibility is another, not to say that that's a bad thing, it's a good thing, but it requires that you shoulder the responsibility of the freedom. But responsibility per se is what gives your life meaning, genuine meaning in the face of suffering. And young people are they're starving for that. I've been teaching young people for 30 years, and mostly what I've been teaching them about is responsibility. It's like you're heirs to a great tradition. It's not perfect, obviously, but comparatively, there's nothing else like it that's ever been produced, and it represents a tiny minority of the human polities, most of which are run by murderous, antisocial, psychopathic thugs. And that's seriously. And so what kind of alternative is that? We've got this beacon of freedom and wealth in the West that works, so it doesn't work perfectly. And one of the responsibilities of young people is to find out what's at the core of that, the great core of that, the paramount importance of the individual and the divinity of speech, man. That's something to sell. It's what our whole culture is predicated on. All right, well, I should stop there. So thank you very much for the invitation.
All right, we put those lights back on up front. So obviously he's not a big fan, but I love some of the themes he's unpacking for us. And if you want to go back to when I was talking to you about Hegel, who tried to do this grand unifying story of history, that it's the Spirit of God manifesting itself through history until humankind self-actualizes back into the Godhead or whatever. That's in a nutshell. But we talked about after Hegel, instead of it being this utopic transcendence back into the Godhead, it's more like that flower went to seed. And two of the major seeds that affected the 20th century were Kierkegaardian existentialism, that radical individualism, which became so much a part of the Western psyche. And then we had Marxist collectivism in the East. And, it can be called communism, but I prefer to call it Marxism because it's based in this idea that there is no God, there's only the physical material world. So if you want a better life for you and yours and your children, the people that have the big piece of pie, are not going to share it unless you make them. And so you have to put pressure on those people, the oppressors or the haves, if you want them to share with the have-nots. Kierkegaard, on the other hand, he's coming from a theistic or even a Christian perspective, And his emphasis is on the individual, that it's not your group identity that's going to save you. It's your individual personal relationship with God. And so his emphasis is on the individual, freedom of choice, personal responsibility, living an authentic life. And here the emphasis is working together as a collective. No man is an island. We're interconnected. What I do is going to affect my neighbor. What my neighbor does is going to affect me. And we have to learn to be interdependent instead of independent. And so this is like this huge clash of ideologies philosophically, but it has economic, socio-political, religious consequences. And so it's weird that we had free market capitalism coming out of this sort of mentality, and we, in a lot of ways, we get communism or socialism coming out of this collective mentality. And I think the coronavirus is such a great way to highlight this difference, right? And people's responses. The more radical individuals, they're all about, don't mess with my freedom or my personal rights. You do not get to tell me that I have to put something over my face, or I have to stay away from my family or loved ones. That's up to me and my loved ones to decide. Where the collective is saying, stop being so selfish, so self-centered. This is a community issue. We need everyone on board. We need everyone participating. And these two sides are just talking past each other, both seeing each other as the problem, right? And I would definitely throw, but this is kind of like the conflict that we have. You could divide it up other ways as too. In our country, it's almost like urban versus rural. There's like a different mentality of country folks than city folks. If you did an overlay of the last several elections, you can see it's overwhelmingly liberal or democratic in urban centers, and it's overwhelmingly conservative Republican in more rural regions. And it's shocking. Oregon's a great example. Almost the entire state of Oregon is incredibly conservative, but Portland is uber liberal. But so many people live in Portland, it evens out all the other people in the state for the most part. So if people can take that one county in Oregon, it can flip an entire election for the state. And you can see how that would frustrate people. But the same way, if you have like New York and California, Illinois, with all this political clout and power, like I mentioned, the election was only 7 million vote difference. 5 million of those votes came from California. Isn't that amazing? 5 of those 7 million extra votes.
For me personally, this is so frustrating because I like see so much validity in both, like in the individual and the collective.
Like a true postmodern.
So it's like I just keep getting like just mind like frustrated because it's like I want there to be both. Like I want there to be like a working paradox between the two, you know, because like I see validity in both.
And that was Hegel's whole stick, if you remember, the truth is the whole. You need to find a way to incorporate the individual and the collective. It shouldn't be an either or sort of process. But the people that came after him, they just took the parts they liked. Like Marx, I told you, he liked Hegel's structure, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but he didn't like the whole God part. And Kierkegaard liked the God part, but he hated the structure part. And so they both took the parts they wanted and then threw the rest away. So here we have a theism versus naturalism, materialism, if you want to look at it in a worldview piece. Although very precious few Christians would identify existentialism as theistic. But it obviously, the way Kierkegaard presents it, it is. But the way Nietzsche or Camus or Sartre present it is atheistic or agnostic. And I don't know, it's so fascinating to me because I have been in this camp for so long, but more and more I'm beginning to realize there is a place to be part of a collective, to be part of a group, to look out for the safety and well-being of others, not just myself. And whether I like to admit it or not, I like this hermit mentality. I am interdependent with others to a degree. Like, I'm not just living off the land on my own somewhere. I mean, I'm interconnected with my students, with my family, with my church, with the people in my community. And I'm not just this free agent that has no obligations or duties or responsibilities to my fellow humanity. What I think is interesting though, and this part I can't give up yet, I don't want to, is I want to have a personal identity. I don't want my identity to be in a group because I don't like those labels. I don't even like to be called a Christian. And it's not because I'm ashamed of Christ, it's because I'm ashamed of other Christians or what other people think that means. And it may have nothing to do with what I think it means to be a Christian. But there is a point where I do need to identify with, I am a Christian. That is part of my group identity. But I don't want to give up my personal identity either. The only person I want to give that up to is Jesus, not to a group. But, you know, I don't know, I feel like I'm rambling again.
No, you're right. I'm sure I am, and I can definitely relate to you.
But the whole church is based on community, right? So it's not like we can just take one column and say, oh, this is the Christian column, and oh, this is the worldly column, because they both have really important elements or values or virtues. And I'm with you, Autumn. How do we synthesize these back together where we show the incredible, profound importance of each individual, and they're all unique, but then, yeah, we are also part of groups or a society or a religion or a culture.
Part of me thinks that maybe like Christianity should be the answer to that, like should be that synthesis.
Yes, me too.
Because like when it talks about the body, it talks about like how the eye cannot do what the ear does, or the hand cannot do like what the foot does. Like there's emphasis on the individual, but
Yes,
there's also like emphasis on like the collective,
the unity.
yeah, aspect of a whole. So like that just maybe in a way is kind of like a measuring rod. It's like what Christianity has been in a way.
Right. But that's part of my problem is when people say conservative Christian today or evangelical today, people aren't thinking, oh, unity through diversity. That's not. If anything, they're thinking the opposite of that.
Yeah.
How about my online folks? Am I wrong there, or do you see it that way?
Yeah, I remember this one time.
Speak up a little.
I remember this one time somebody asked me, like, I was like, I came to terms with, like, yeah, I'm pretty conservative in the fact that I'm pretty traditional, right, like, for my family. And they just totally, they were just so, like, gasped. They looked at me different because of what they portrayed as, like,
Conservative.
Conservative. I was like, whoa. Let's come to an understanding of what I meant by that. We're very traditional in our culture. It doesn't mean that I'm not politically conservative. You know? You're absolutely right. People, I mean,
That's why you gotta get people to define their terms.
Yeah,
So you're at least having a conversation and
Yeah.
not talking past each other.
yeah.
And that's why I want to go over critical theory with you all next week. And so you at least, whether you like it or hate it, it can be from a place of knowledge, not from sound bites or because it's lining up or not lining up with whatever other groups you happen to be a part of. And I think that's the problem. People just line up, they start putting
Like
categories and, oh, those are liberal agenda items, those are conservative agenda items. And it's just like, couldn't these just be like human being agenda items? And why does it have to do with the left and right and all of that?
Why do you think we categorize the whole? I don't know, try to think, like, why do we, because as soon as we put ourselves in a box and a category, like we limit ourselves.
That's Kierkegaard.
But the thing, yeah, to the contrary, that like.
I really feel like I'm beating a horse to death, but one more for the road. And then next week, first we'll start with critical theory, and then I want to move to the John Stott Christian counterculture. Oh, I can find my copy. Who knows, we might have it in the library online or something. I'll look.
You want me to look?
Yeah,
What's it called?
Christian Counterculture by John Stott, S-T-O-T-T.
So I want to recommend a book first to everyone here. It's called Explaining Postmodernism.
I'm going to give you one more from John
So the fun
Peterson.
thing with the serpent is, how does a serpent talk? And not only that, but why is the serpent's punishment to crawl on its belly when that's what it does?
Who's this guy?
If you don't know how,
You may not realize it, but you are currently funding some dangerous people. And they are indoctrinating young minds throughout the West with their resentment-ridden ideology. They have made it their life's mission to undermine Western civilization itself,
Recognize
which
the
they
voice?
regard as corrupt, oppressive, and patriarchal. If you're a taxpayer or paying for your kid's liberal arts degree, you're underwriting this gang of nihilists. You're supporting
That's what
ideologues
that
who
guy
claim that
called
all
me.
truth is subjective, that all sex differences are socially constructed, and that Western imperialism is the sole source of all third world problems. They are the postmodernists, pushing progressive activism at a college near you. They produce the mobs that violently shut down campus speakers, the language police who enshrine into law
He's
use
really
of
upset about
fabricated
that.
gender pronouns, and the deans whose livelihoods depend on madly rooting out discrimination where little or none exists. Their thinking took hold in Western universities in the 60s and 70s, when the true believers of the radical left became the professors of today.
Oh dear.
And now we rack up education-related debt, not so that our children learn to think critically, write clearly, or speak properly, but so they can model their mentors' destructive agenda.
Okay. That whole list he just gave, to think critically, to write correctly, to speak, however you put it, based on whose standard? I mean, I've studied anthropological linguistics, and the consensus is there is no superior language or dialect in the world. That all languages and all dialects perform the function of language of enabling the speakers to communicate and survive and gain knowledge and that sort of thing. And we have, in academia in the United States, we have chosen American Standard English as our standard. It sounds redundant, American Standard English. We don't teach Oxfordian English or the Queen's English in America. But if you were studying at Edinburgh or Oxford, that is what you would be expected to speak in, to write in, otherwise you'd be like an uneducated country bumpkin or an American or something of that nature. Why don't we use Ebonics in schools? Why don't we use that as the standard? Because that is not the prevailing academic culture who makes the rules. But him just categorically acting like writing correctly, speaking correctly, begs the question. Who gets to make the standard? And why are you so offended it's being challenged? There are other ways to teach than in the Western paradigm. Like the lecture, the students take notes, then they regurgitate the answers back to the professor, and you're educated if you can do that. What nonsense. Okay, sorry.
You can even bring that,
Sorry.
I was thinking you can even bring that into the church, like, who says that it has to just be a pastor standing up in front of everybody every single Sunday, and his is the only where the people say
Right,
it.
why couldn't we all sit around in a big circle and look at each other and remember Christ is the head, not the person on stage? Careful, Autumn, you're wading into postmodern waters.
It's now possible to complete an English degree and never encounter Shakespeare, one of those dead white males whose works underlie our society of oppression. To understand and oppose the postmodernists, the ideas by which they orient themselves must be clearly identified. First is their new unholy trinity of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is defined not by opinion, but by race, ethnicity, or sexual identity. Equity is no longer the laudable goal of equality of opportunity, but the insistence on equality of outcome. And inclusion is the use of identity-based quotas to attain this misconceived state of equity. All the
Like
classic rights of the
affirmative
West
action.
are to be considered secondary to these new values. Take, for example, freedom of speech, the very pillar of democracy. The postmodernists refuse to believe that people of goodwill can exchange ideas and reach consensus. Their world is instead a Hobbesian nightmare of identity groups warring for power. They don't see ideas that run contrary to their ideology as simply incorrect. They see them as integral to the oppressive system they wish to supplant, and consider it a moral obligation to stifle and constrain their expression. Second is rejection of the free market, of the very idea that free voluntary trading benefits everyone. They won't acknowledge that capitalism has lifted up hundreds of millions of people so they can, for the first time in history, afford food, shelter, clothing, transportation, even entertainment and travel. Those classified as poor in the US and increasingly everywhere else are able to meet their basic needs. Meanwhile, in once prosperous Venezuela, until recently the poster child of the campus radicals, the middle class lines up for toilet paper. Third and finally are the politics of identity. Postmodernists don't believe in individuals. You're an exemplar of your race, sex, or sexual preference. You're also either a victim or an oppressor. No wrong can be done by anyone in the former group, and no good by the latter. Such ideas of victimization do nothing but justify the use of power and engender intergroup conflict. All these concepts originated with Karl Marx, the 19th century German philosopher. Marx viewed the world as a gigantic class struggle, the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, the grasping rich against the desperate poor. But wherever his ideas were put into practice, in the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, and Cambodia, to name just a few, whole economies failed and tens of millions were killed. We fought a decades-long Cold War to stop the spread of those murderous notions, but they're back in the new guise of identity politics. The corrupt ideas of the postmodern neo-Marxists should be consigned to the dustbin of history. Instead, we underwrite their continuance in the very institutions where the central ideas of the West should be transmitted across the generations. Unless we stop, postmodernism will do to America and the entire Western world what it's already done to its universities. I'm Jordan Peterson, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto for Prager University.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you for watching this video. To help keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible
There you
donation.
go. There he is. So we're out of time, but hopefully that's making it clear what we're talking about. So postmodernism is a lot more than just rejecting modernism. Coming with it are a lot of these other ideas. But even here, even Marxism is a meta-narrative. And so I would say a true postmodernist would reject his grand story, just like he would reject Christianity's or Kierkegaard's or capitalism, because those are all those big stories.
That's the assumption that they're looking at it through like an unbiased lens.
Right, and obviously Jordan Peterson was using a lot of hyperbole. I mean, he was a very effective speaker to make his points, but it's not that clear cut, is it? It's a lot muddier than he was trying to just make these very clear lines. And you guys can go if you need to, but I can't. I'll never forget after one class, someone asked me to bring up one of these Prager University videos, and I love them just because they're so right-wing conservative. They really unpack that point of view well. So it's nice to use as kind of a foil when discussing these things. But I pulled it up, and it had to do with your liberal educators and how they were corrupting the youth of America. And I asked the student, I said, why did you want me to show that to the class? Is there something you want to say to me? And she was like, she didn't even know what I was talking about, but I said, everything that they were pointing out in that video is talking about me as a professor. And it's like she didn't even realize that. And I was like, the whole enemy you're describing is someone like me, because I'm wanting to question the status quo. I'm wanting you to think for yourself. I'm wanting you to look at how we got to where we are today. But that means you might have problems with the existing power structures or the way things are. Instead of me just telling you to conform, comply, this is truth, this is ethical behavior, this is what the Bible means, this is how you're a good citizen. I'm not doing that. I'm trying to give you different ideas and perspectives and show you their various strengths and weaknesses, because I'm an educator. I'm not an indoctrinator. And yeah, it's dangerous to be educated. And this is another question I like to ask my students. Why is it that the more educated people become, as a general rule, the more liberal they are? Now, there could be multiple answers to that question. One could be because you're being educated by liberal people that are corrupting your mind. But the other is, as you become more aware and you get out of your little bubble, you become much more broad-minded, because you realize the way you were brought up is not the only way to perceive the world. And the more that expands, the more broad-minded you are probably going to become. It doesn't mean you still can't believe, like in the Bible, or an objective right and wrong, good and evil, things like that. But it's probably going to be a much broader view than if you never left your home, you never left your town, you never left your church, and you just had that same message, and everyone around you was reinforcing that.
I don't know if you were gonna do this, but like I know for me personally, I've grown up in a very like conservative